Chapter 6 First Contact. She had Johnny's words in her head, but tried to keep the whole of it in her perspective. It wasn't something he'd done. It was the way his life had been. She was well aware that she had been privileged with a sheltered life. Did she like him enough that she would keep an open mind when he told her? She thought she did. When he walked her home the next evening, she knew she did. The next day at sunset, a squadron of Spitfires thundered over. More patrols, she thought. Then, a while later, Duncan came through from behind. Bombers hit Scapa Flow. That must be where the lads have been sent. She felt like her stomach had flipped upside down. They were off to real combat. Oh, dear Lord, let them be safe. The waters of Scapa Flow unfolded ahead and below, reflecting the last bit of light from the horizon. It was growing dark fast. Squadron leader Fred Whitaker flew ahead, and the rest of them falls in line abreast. Danny held Johnny's wingtip in his line of sight. There was smoke ahead on the water, searchlights combing the dull twilight. "This is Yellow Leader. Watch for bandits." Then chaos broke out. Searchlights picked out a Ju-88. There was already a hurricane from one of the Scottish squadrons on its tail, tracer blazing. The bombers were making a break for it, fleeing the fighters. Fred's voice came over the static. "Let's give 'em a run home." Ahead of Danny, a rapidly falling away spotlight managed to light up a bomber, and he fired a burst but didn't know whether he hit or not. Johnny's tracer also lit up the sky with sparks, and he could hear the stutter of the 303 Browning machine guns. They chased the bombers till their fuel ran low and had to break for home. It was fully dark then. They were debriefed, had tea, ate dinner, and finally could wash off the sweat of the day. There was a slight tremor in Danny. It had been his first taste of combat. Though no kills had been confirmed, it was still a strange thing to be firing at a live target. Jan was one of the catering wharfs on duty again. He smiled at her. "I'll tell Elle you'll be round for lunch tomorrow?" "Thank you, Jan." Some of the men, including Johnny, had been at the attack on Scapa Flow in October the previous year. Johnny had gotten an unconfirmed hit then and was telling the story to some of the newer airmen. It had been a much bigger raid with more mutual damage, but Danny felt sure this was the start of their war. The defenses all around them were falling, and some other squadrons had already seen heavy combat over Holland and France. The time was coming very soon that they would have to face the Luftwaffe over England. They had Sunday lunch, and it was warm enough for Eleanor to wear one of her flowery summer dresses she had bought in London. With Patricia out of the way, Johnny also came. Eleanor noticed him watching her and Danny, and once, when she caught his eye, he smiled and winked. He was, indeed, smug. After lunch and clearing up, Eleanor suggested going for a walk. She was restless. Jan and Tim didn't want to join, but to her surprise, Johnny did and brought some beers along. They found themselves drifting in the direction of Duncan's field. They made themselves comfortable next to the water. Eleanor sat sedately on the log. Johnny stretched himself out in the grass on his side. Danny settled next to Eleanor, leaning back against the log. Johnny opened 3 beers and passed them out. The cows came closer and watched them curiously. Johnny held his beer out to one, and it licked interestedly. "Our daring Irishman, corrupting the morals of even the local cows," Danny teased. Johnny squinted at him through one eye. "I've no lady to take to the dance next weekend since you've claimed my favorite girl in the world. I'm thinking I'm losing my charm and I must maybe settle for one of these lassies. At least they like beer and not the expensive stuff." "Ask Annabeth, Johnny. She'd jump for a chance." Johnny rolled his eyes. "That lassie is looking for a husband. I do well to steer clear. Ah, you'd got a fine figure of a man pushing a pram down the street. This time she got the one-eyed blue squint. Not for many years, my darling girl. You two will be pushing prams long before I do. I'll catch me a 20-year-old when I turn 40 and settle down, but not before then. Big dreams, buddy. Danny was smiling. And I can just see it, the two of you, though. You will be flying a transatlantic clipper and making the big money, and Eleanor will be waiting with 3 toddlers around her skirts. And I'll come and be their bad uncle. Eleanor laughed and threw some grass at his head. Danny stretched his legs out. Johnny will be flying mercenary missions, running guns and cash in South America or Mexico. I like it. You know me like no one else, my friend. Maybe the 20-year-old will be a Mexican señorita, and her papa will be a rich don. It was all in such good fun, and yet Eleanor had a hollow feel in her stomach, wondering where they all would be in 5 or 10 or 20 years. The war wasn't going well. Everything was closing in on them, and she tried every day to block out the feeling of dread and live the happiness of the moment. But the bad news kept on coming. Why so serious, Elle? Johnny was looking intently at her. I'm scared, she blurted. I don't know what's to become of us. Everything seems so bad, and it's like the bad news is a net around us that's drawing closer and closer every day. Danny tilted his head back to look up at her, took her hand. I know, but it's not over, darling. The RAF have barely begun to do their thing, and we're working on so many improvements. We're learning, we're getting better. And these boys are good, they're fighters. They won't win as long as there's a scrap of Air Force left. His dark hair fell back from his face, his eyes looking earnestly up at her. We know our business, and we've all got something to fight for. It's personal. They won't beat us. It was the first time he'd called her darling, and the first time she'd noticed the long, jagged white scar running across his forehead just under his hairline. She reached out and touched it. What happened there, Danny? He flinched, gently took her hand away, slipping his fingers between hers. It was Johnny who spoke up before Danny could. He hit his head in a crash while learning to fly. Hell of a story, he should tell you sometime. But we should probably start heading back. His blue eyes held hers for a moment, and she knew. She looked at Danny. It was right there in his face, too, the slight paleness around his eyes, the wry twist to his mouth. I'll tell you one day. It's not a nice story. She reached out on purpose, brushed his hair back across his forehead. You can tell me when you're ready. If you never tell me, that's all right, too. He closed his eyes and nodded. I'll tell you. You should hear the story. Thank you, darling.